Hi everyone, it's Bryony. Welcome back to my channel. And in today's video, I'm going to be talking about how I chose my sperm donor. For any of you out there considering donor conception for whatever reason, maybe you're a solo parent by choice to be, or maybe you're in a relationship and you need to use a donor for whatever reason, here are some of the things that I took into consideration when I was choosing my own sperm donor. So I guess the first thing to say is that everybody has different priorities when it comes to choosing a sperm donor, and things that will matter to you may be very different from the things that matter to me. And it's important to say that that is totally fine. There is no rule book when it comes to choosing sperm. It's only a case of finding a donor that feels right for you and your family. I'm not going to be sharing any sort of specific details about the donor that I chose because I think that information is private, but I'm going to give you some of the generic things that were important to me and some of the reasons why those things were important to me as well. So the first thing that was important to me when choosing a donor was to use a non-anonymous donor. Now in the UK, it's actually the law that you have to use a non-anonymous donor now. It changed back in like 2005, so it's been quite a while that you can't use one. However, treatment is often a little bit cheaper abroad, so even if I had travelled abroad to countries in Europe where it is still legal to use anonymous donations, I still would have personally chosen a non-anonymous donor. The difference between an anonymous and a non-anonymous donor is that an anonymous donor cannot be contacted at any point, even after a child turns 18, whereas a non-anonymous donor, a child can be given identifying information about their donor once they turn 18 and can also make contact with them if they wish. There's no guarantee through using a non-anonymous donor that that donor is going to want to have contact with the child in the future, whether that be contact through letter, contact through email, contact in person, like meeting them. That's different for every donor, and there's no way to guarantee that you're going to choose a donor who is happy to meet your child face to face in the future. But generally speaking, choosing a non-anonymous donor, that donor has consented to being contacted when the child is 18, so they know that is an option out there, whereas an anonymous donor potentially could be tracked down through using DNA testing and other measures. However, they haven't opted to be contacts in the future, so they might be less willing to be open to that. And it also depends on the countries where people are donated to, because like I said, anonymous donation is now illegal in the UK, so anybody who has donated here in the last like 18 years has had to consent to having identifying information given to any donor children when they turn 18 for quite a while now. But other countries, it is still legal for people to do anonymous donation, and they do it with the understanding that they're not going to ever be contacted. So there is a lot of ethical reasons and things to consider with that. But for me, I felt it was really important that my child had the option to contact their donor when they're 18, because ultimately that is half of their DNA. That is something that they may be really interested in knowing more about. It might not be something that's that important to them, but I felt really strongly that it should be their choice, and I will be supportive of them whatever they decide to do in the future. But making sure they had the option was really key to me, and that is why a non-anonymous donor was so important, and I would still have used a non-anonymous donor if I had travelled overseas for treatment. The second thing that was important to me when I chose a sperm donor was choosing a donor who looked similar to me. Now, when it comes to the actual physical looks of your donor, everyone is a bit different with this. Some people choose donors based off of features they have which are similar to people that they're attracted to. If you're part of a couple, and for example a same-sex couple, you might choose a donor who looks similar to your partner who is not using their eggs to conceive the child, so that you can have some features that are similar to them within your child too. For me, however, it was important to choose a donor who had features that were similar to my own. One of the reasons that choosing a donor who looked similar to me was important to me, though, is because throughout my time as a foster carer, I became more aware of the world of adoption, and particularly transracial adoption and the experience of transracial adoptees. When a child is adopted by parents who are a different ethnicity to them, in doing that you often take away their ability to have the choice of whether or not they disclose that they're adopted, because it's quite obvious that they are a different race from their parents. And I know from speaking to friends of mine who are transracial adoptees, but also from watching videos online of the experience of transracial adoptees, that this can be something that's quite challenging for them. Another issue with transracial adoption as well is that they're often white parents, typically from the US, who adopt children who are from Black and other ethnic minorities, and so they are not able to relate to some of the experiences that those children go through growing up, and that can be really difficult for those children who are transracial adoptees. Now obviously not everyone has the same experience, but for me, particularly going into this as a white woman who comes from a white family, there is nobody within my extended family except for one cousin whose partner is not white and who has children, but they live in Australia, aside from them, there is nobody else in my family who is not white. So given that my child was already going to be a little bit different from their peers at school because they come from a solo parent household and they are also donor conceived, I wanted to make that experience as easy for them as possible with other ways. And so one of the things I wanted to do was to try and choose a donor who looked similar to me, so that there was a good chance that my child would also look similar to me, and therefore people would just assume we were related, rather than them having to go through, that's my mum, and someone saying, really? Because you don't look like her. I just felt that their life would be a little bit easier if people automatically assumed that they were my child. And I have to say, it has kind of worked so far, because my son Oren does look very similar to me, and we share a lot of features, and we have the same sort of hair colour and eye colour, and so I do think it is something that's going to make life a little bit easier as time goes on. Ultimately, I would have loved a child that I had no matter what, but I do quite like having a child who looks pretty similar to me, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Another thing that was important to me personally was having a donor from a similar cultural background. Again, kind of similar to the point before with, you know, wanting to be able to fully meet the identity needs of my child. I wanted to be able to cover as much of their identity, not just from our side, but from the donor side as well. And so choosing a donor who is from a sort of similar religious background, but also from a culture or a country which was close enough for us to visit, or that I am somewhat familiar with, because there's quite a few European donors around, and luckily living in the UK it's not too difficult to travel far, so having a donor from a country that was reasonably near meant that we would be able to travel there and explore that side of their culture as well. There's very, very few British donors around, and they get snapped up really quickly, so I was never able to find a British donor, and certainly not a British donor who looked like me. As it turns out, and if you ever do happen to go sperm shopping, you'll know this, there's actually very, very few minority donors out there. The vast majority of sperm donors are white, blonde hair, blue-eyed donors, and that is because a lot of sperm donors are from Denmark. So actually, even finding a kind of Caucasian, and I wasn't concerned about the skin tone of the donor I chose, whether they were fair, mid-toned, olive-skinned, you know, that didn't bother me at all. It was mainly like the brown hair and the brown eyes that I was concerned with. But finding a donor with those sorts of features was actually not as easy as I thought it might be, and it's even harder to find a donor if you are from a minority background, although there are a couple around. But actually, the vast majority of sperm donors are Caucasian. There's very few minority donors out there, and particularly when you look on the kind of UK and European sperm sites, you'll see that the majority of them are European, because they've obviously donated locally, and also that they are typically white, and as I said before, a lot of them have blonde hair, blue eyes. I personally was looking for a brown hair, brown eyed donor, even though brown hair and brown eyes are supposed to be, I should know about brown hair, but brown eyes is definitely supposed to be the dominant gene, so it's possible they would have still had them even if I had chosen a blue-eyed donor, but still I thought like choosing a brown-eyed one, God, it gave me better odds. But I was able to find a few, but it is worth noting that if you are from a minority background and you do want to have a donor who matches your ethnicity, it might be harder for you to find that. The next thing that was important to me was to use a sperm bank that had more information. So when you go through fertility treatment, quite a lot of the fertility clinics themselves will have their own sperm banks which you can use, and it is slightly cheaper to use them because A, you don't get quite as much information about the donors aside from like some very basic features like colouring, eye colour, hair colour. I think you get a bit about their job and maybe some of their interests, but not really much else. And also because they are donated to the clinic, there's no shipping costs involved, and the shipping costs can be quite expensive with shipping sperm around. But to me, with something as important as choosing half the genetics of my future child, I felt like I really wanted to take the time to choose a donor where I could get a lot of information about them, and also because I wanted to be able to see some of their medical history. The medical info was important to me personally because on my dad's side of the family, there is a history of heart problems running through a lot of the men, and so I really wanted to choose a donor who didn't have any sort of history of heart problems within their own family to try and like minimize the risk of that happening to any future offspring that I had. I also wanted to choose a sperm bank that did some form of genetic testing on their donors and ruled them out on some of the big things like cystic fibrosis, I think spinal muscular atrophy is also outruled by mine, Tay-Sachs disease, and there's a few others as well. As somebody who was chronically sick in my teens, the last thing I would wish on anyone is any sort of condition, and although my own illness was not genetic, it was caused by bacteria, I felt that because I was going down the sperm donor route and I did have the option to have a little bit more information and to be able to make more of a choice around this, that it would be sensible to consider it. That obviously doesn't rule out the risk, and in fact the sperm bank that I did go with, they actually had an option where I think you could pay, it was quite expensive, but like another £900 to basically test your DNA and compare it to the DNA of the donor you chose. and they would see if there were any genetic conditions that lined up between you. So if you both shared a gene, then they would basically give you the option to switch your donor without any additional charge. So if you have a genetic condition that runs in your family and you know you want to try and avoid passing it on to any of your children, you can have this test done with the sperm donor and see if they also have that gene, particularly if it's a gene that has to have both parents be a carrier of. So that's one of the benefits of going down the sperm donor route, is you can do this testing as well. I didn't opt to do that test because, as far as I'm aware, there aren't any genetic conditions within my own family that are inheritable, and I felt like there's always a risk, even if you have a baby with somebody who you've met as a partner, and even just being able to have a bit more information about the donor and knowing that the sperm quality is going to be good, because I think it's like only 8% of donors that apply actually get approved as sperm donors. They're really picky about like medical history, quality of the sperm, etc. So knowing that I was choosing a donor from this kind of relatively small pool of donors who'd already been through testing, who had blood tests done, etc., and who had had some genetic testing done on them, I felt was good enough for me personally. Plus, with the medical history that I got through the sperm bank, I was able to see not only the donor's medical history, well, significant medical needs history, but also the parents' medical history and both sets of grandparents too. So that way I was able to say, hey, okay, there's no history of heart problems here. There is always going to be something going on. Everyone has health problems at some point or other. You're never going to find a donor with a completely clean bill of health, and it's important to remember that. But there were no conditions that sort of aligned between both of our families, and so that's what I was mainly looking for. Another thing that was really important to me when choosing a sperm donor was I didn't want to use a donor from an American sperm bank. The reason for this is that in the UK we have a family limit of 10, and that means that one donor can only have 10 donor families from that donor. However, it's worth remembering, if you use a donor, particularly a donor from overseas or even a donor from a UK sperm bank, that doesn't mean that there are not more than 10 families outside of the UK, because there are no international laws when it comes to the number of donor children that can be conceived, which I think is a real issue within the donor conceived world. Sperm banks may say that they set the number of donor families per donor at a certain amount, but there's actually nothing legally binding them to that, so they can kind of say what they want when it comes to this. But the laws within certain countries mean that whenever a donor reaches that country's limit, that sperm can no longer be shipped to that country unless it's to one of the families that's already used it. This is why when you use a sperm bank from the UK, you often have to buy a pregnancy slot, which was like £500, I think, and that basically means you reserve a slot with that donor. If you don't end up conceiving successfully with that sperm donor, then you can have that pregnancy slot refunded, but if you do, then you don't get your money back. So I had to pay £500 for the donor that I chose to basically reserve a UK slot for him. But it is possible for a donor to have reached the limit of 10 families in the UK, but also have 3 families in Norway, 2 families in France, 2 families in Denmark, you know, many more to be spread out. But within a country, they can control it. It's just not outside the country as well. So do bear in mind, when you see that 10 family limit, if you are UK based or wherever you are in the world, that limit only applies to the country. It doesn't mean that there are not more children conceived with that donor elsewhere, because sperm banks do ship sperm between them. But European sperm banks do not ship sperm to the United States because of a rule that the FDA put in, I think, in 2005. So if you use a European sperm donor, then their sperm is only going to be confined to Europe. It's not going to have been shipped to the United States. You can, however, import sperm from the US into the UK. So I could have used a sperm donor from the US, but the US has like no laws whatsoever, and it's not terribly uncommon to find sperm donors who have had like 50, 100, 150 children conceived from one donor, because the sperm banks there just have free reign. So that's something I was really keen to avoid. I didn't want to have a baby and then find out that they had like 30 half siblings in the US, because I felt that that wouldn't be good for their well-being personally. So whilst using a European sperm donor, again, the family laws in the UK don't apply elsewhere, it does at least reduce the chance of them having a large number of siblings, like they potentially could if I'd used a US donor. So those were the main things that were important to me when it came to choosing a sperm donor. I thought it'd also be interesting to talk about some of the things that didn't matter to me so much. The first one of which was photos. I actually was not that bothered about whether I chose a donor with or without a baby photo. Some sperm banks will not do any photos whatsoever. Some sperm banks do just baby photos, and some sperm banks, but only in the US, will do adult photos of the donor. I personally did not want to see any adult pictures of the donor. I found that was too bizarre. And the baby pictures, like, they were kind of cute from time to time to see, but I actually found that it wasn't that much of a big deal to me. I was much more interested in, like, the general vibe that I got from the profile of the donor I was looking at, the things that they liked, the handwritten note that they had, particularly on the sperm bank that I chose, they had these as an option. And of course that we had sort of similar features based off of what they said with the hair colour, eye colour, etc. So I found that that was actually the thing that was more important to me, was getting an impression of who they were through the profile rather than any pictures. So that was interesting, because I know for a lot of people, seeing a photograph of them, particularly seeing a baby photograph of them, is something that really matters to them before choosing a donor. But to me, it was not something that I was bothered by. And the other thing that did not bother me was their education status or their job. A lot of these donors are guys kind of in their early 20s, and so they've not exactly had time to build massive careers. But also, like, I just feel that a lot of that can be down to environment and circumstance, and, you know, there's always this nature versus nurture, and it really was not something that bothered me at all. I was much more interested in how they came across through their profile. Did they seem like someone friendly and approachable? Did they seem like they'd done this for mainly altruistic reasons? You know, I just wanted a sense that the donor was somebody who I would feel comfortable with if I met them in real life. And their education or job status just really wasn't that important to me. So a combination of all those things together is how I ended up choosing my sperm donor that I used to conceive my son. I personally didn't spend too much time deliberating about it. I think it took me like an hour to choose him from one of the sperm banks that I liked the look of, that was European based, like I said, not American based. And once I saw him, I was like, yeah, I'm just going to go with that. And I decided I didn't want to spend time like over-analysing, was I choosing the right donor or anything. I just wanted to get a sense of the right vibe, that the looks were kind of what I was looking for, that I felt like we matched on most of the cultural basis. And actually I think the donor that I found kind of felt like a perfect fit for me, because it was, you know, like a cultural identity I felt like I was sort of familiar with. Religiously we matched up, looks wise exactly what I was looking for, and his just general vibe from the profile was what I was thinking would be good. So I was like, yeah, let's go with this one. And that's just basically what I did. And overall, honestly, if you do go ahead with this and you do have a baby, once they're here, it really doesn't matter. You love them so much regardless. But I do appreciate when you're in the stage of choosing a sperm donor, it does feel like a really, really big decision. And it's certainly not one that I took lightly. It is something I thought about a long time before, and I already had an idea in my head of the things that I wanted to look for and things that were important to me. So I hope that watching this video was helpful if you are on the journey to solo parenthood, or on a donor conception journey, however that might be for you. As always, thank you so much for watching, guys. Do please subscribe. If you want to consider joining my membership, the Superstars, take a look at the join button down below and see some of the benefits you can get from that. Other than that, guys, I will see you next week. I hope you have a great day. Bye, everyone.